Welcome to the third podcast from the Millennial Global Review. We appreciate you tuning in and we hope you enjoy. Today we're going to talk about briefly on a couple of topics, including the Alabama special election, the changes to the CDC's vocabulary, and the FCC and net neutrality, and potentially other stuff, so stay tuned. Starting off, we're just going to play you a video. I interviewed a friend of mine in Alabama who is a Republican and had an interesting perspective on the election there. I'd heard your story. I know you campaigned for Luther Strange in the primary, and being in Alabama, I thought you'd have an interesting perspective on the recent election, so just your take on what happened.
I was very pleased with the outcome. Initially, I planned to write in for Luther Strange because in Alabama, you have the opportunity to write in for a candidate. But after the sexual assault allegations, 9 allegations corroborated by more than 30 people came out, I figured that I would have no issue voting for Doug Jones. And it was just really remarkable to watch how he flipped counties that were unflippable, solid red counties flipping for him, with African-American turnout, 80 to 90% that of a presidential election, while, Caucasian and conservative turnout was 30, 40%, very much something you would expect from a special election. So it was remarkable. Everything had to go in Doug's way, and it did. And he pulled it off by the narrowest of margins.
Interesting perspective, Eric. My other question, kind of regarding something you posted on social media, was like the idea of country over party and what that meant to you in this case, and how you think that played out with your peers and what you saw kind of coming out of young people in that audience our age and what their general thoughts were on the allegations and on the election.
Yeah, so I didn't know many Roy Moore supporters, but I know a lot of peers who are Republicans and consider themselves Republicans, and we're all just starting to vote. So I can't think of anyone any of my friends who are Republicans that voted for Roy Moore, because he isn't really reflective of Republican values. It's more just kind of a racist and religious overtaking that kind of hijacked the campaign. Not really a lot of conservative or Republican thinking in his campaigning. But for the most part, the young people rallied around Doug Jones from the beginning. But it was interesting to see a lot of people who worked with me on the Luther Strange campaign, young people, interns, who ended up voting for Doug Jones and really having no issue with it. And a lot of older people didn't have the same willingness to cross party lines. So that was just kind of interesting to see, and a lot of older people, my dad in particular, were shocked that I voted for Doug Jones when they were staunchly supporting a write-in candidate. So it was good to see. It's kind of indicative of what needs to happen nationally to end the gridlock and the partisanship that is kind of stagnated our federal government. So I think that this election can kind of serve as a testament to what happens when people put country over party instead of, existing in simply a partisan environment, and people can look at the quality of a candidate over that of their party. So
yeah, absolutely. It's a great response. Really appreciate it. Haley Rogers, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
So I thought it was really interesting to hear his perspective. I don't know anyone from Alabama, so that was certainly, I think, important to hear. One thing that he did say that was interesting to me was he was talking about Doug Jones and kind of using active words to describe Doug Jones winning the election. But from the way I see it, Doug Jones didn't really win. What won the election obviously he is now Alabama's representative, but what won the election for him was the media and Roy Moore's actions and whatnot. And we see how the margin was so narrow for Doug Jones to have won, that even so, if this scandal didn't come out, it's pretty evident that Doug Jones would have lost this election. And so when you look at it from that perspective, I think you see that he didn't win the election for himself.
I think he definitely true. I think in a lot of ways, he didn't lose the election, and that's what won him it. And I think that some of what that he did there was actually conscious in that, he didn't elevate the election to national issues. He stayed very much on local Alabama issues. And I think that helped him, and almost by staying out of the limelight per se, and just letting Roy Moore occupy all that space, he was able to allow people to focus on what Roy Moore had done. rather than his own policies, which are generally antagonistic to what have been typical Alabama voters' beliefs.
I would agree with that, but like also at the same time, from like a perspective of a Virginian, I wasn't really paying attention to Doug Jones's policies, or I didn't take the time to see what he was about and what he cared for, and still I probably could have told you, like, if I had to vote right now, I would have voted for Doug Jones because of all the negative comments and media that Roy Moore was receiving, and all the bad things that he evidently did. From my perspective, that's a win for Doug Jones, and I don't even know what he's about. Likely he is actually opposes everything that I believe in for the government.
Yeah, there's it's interesting. I really have 2 points about this, and I think the first is talking about what Doug Jones in his campaign did put out. Because as you mentioned, like, Roy Jones was definitely occupying like 99.9% of the media attention, but what Doug Jones was putting out and why he got so much of the black vote in this election is that he put himself out as a civil rights champion, and that's all that I knew about him. And for me, that was enough, because then it became, am I going to vote for somebody who has all these allegations against him? Is it a pedophile? Is like banned from a mall, or a civil rights champion? Like, do I know what he did to become a civil rights champion? No, not really. But it's clearly like a much better option than the latter. And I think that's that kind of brings me to my second point, which brings in terms of like the morality and like who are we as a country? Like, did Americans really want somebody like Roy Moore in office? And and that really says something about, everybody talks about how Alabama went blue and how like amazing that is, but I didn't really think it was that amazing. He got 48% of the vote, and the margin was so small, and he had done despicable things, or so this can't. First of all, I don't think he should have even been on the ballot. A lot of people would agree with me on that, but the fact that he got so much says a lot about the state of our country, and even to me, a perception of the Republican Party that is coming out that isn't really reflective of their platform to me.
I would agree. I thought it was also interesting, one thing we talked about was, I agree with you completely, that was such a narrow margin, and it is kind of frightening to know that, sure, it was a win for women and for ideal sexual assault outlooks from our country, but at the same time there were a significant amount of people that were on his side. I think it's also important to look at the way that Congress responded, and like we kind of talked about this a bit, but they put a blanket statement. Sure, there were a good amount of people that were wavering in the Republican Party, but the majority leader, they put out a significant statement saying that they would open an investigation effective immediately should Roy Moore win, and that was before he even won. So usually those kinds of things, in order to be political, you wait until you have to deal with it to actually confront the issue, but they didn't even do that. Roy Moore hadn't won yet, and they said, should he win, this is what we will do. And so they opened up kind of a can of worms that they didn't need to, because I think that's how seriously they took the issue, which for me is kind of a positive outlook.
Yeah, I think it's ultimately a good thing, and I think setting that strong precedent kind of in coherence with the entire Me Too movement and all of that. You see like Al Franken stepping down from his position and taking that moral high ground, if you want to call it that, is a good thing in general for both parties, and hopefully it is conducive to more than just changes in the Democratic Party, but within the whole political system as a whole. And I think another really important thing Ellie mentioned, which I thought was interesting to touch on, was the idea that the difference between his peers and people our age, young consumers of media and politics, was that they were open to swinging across party lines in order to basically uphold morality over politics, country over party, and the older generation very much so was not in that position. And I think it was Fox that reported 71% of people in Alabama didn't believe the allegations, and of course the majority of the voting base being older consumers. I think interesting to note how that's going to play out in the future as young populations become larger portions of voters.
Yeah.
I think lastly, just one other thing to touch on, I think important within the whole context of that Me Too movement, you saw the Time cover, like People of the Year being the women who came out with these allegations and confirming actions. Was that another Fox report just kind of picked up on a nice subtlety was the elbow on the cover. doesn't show you who it is, but it shows you that there are other people who haven't come forward yet. And I think just keeping in mind that this movement is not over in any way, and I think within both parties there are multiple reports that this has become a pervasive issue. So looking to see this come to some sort of resolution in the future. But yeah, that would be our coverage of the Alabama special election. We are positive on the rejection of a pedophile with morality in mind.
So in other news, the CDC and the HHS recently unveiled to the public that certain words such as vulnerable, entitlement, diversity, evidence-based, science-based, and other words are banned from usage. And since that announcement, there has been an outcry from a number of people coming from both sides, Republican and Democrat, condemning this move by the president's administration.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be interesting to see if we just react to every word, what our first connotations are. And as we read them out, I think you'll see that this is mostly not constructive. It's very much reflective of maybe not partisan beliefs, but Trump's beliefs, and it diverts from past Obama-era emphasis on a lot of these topics. But also, given its Health and Human Services and the CDC, a lot of this is just simply impractical. So I figure we'll just run through every word. So if Amelia, you want to start picking a word?
Sure. I mean, entitlement. I think that's like almost just a personal vendetta for Trump, like, and his kids. You know, like, why entitlement? That's a fact of, you know, our country, is that there are a lot of us who are entitled. Also, like, entitled to something. Like, you can be entitled to free speech, which he's
Clearly being restricted here.
Entitled to benefits, even.
Yeah.
Like to say that, like, government benefits, that is an entitlement according to many people. And I think from Health and Human Services, that's simply like pretending it's not a thing, I guess, by saying you can't be entitled is more reflective of the Trump administration, like you said, than it is of the general populace and the way it's going to be implemented.
And the word I would like to focus on is diversity. And I think this is like, this word to me doesn't even seem related to the CDC or the HHS. This more just seems like, and we've seen this repeatedly since the president's inauguration, simply moves just to simply retract some of the progress made within the Obama administration. This is not even meant to push this country forward. It's just simply used to counteract things that Obama has done or things that he believes Obama has progressed. And I think it's a reaction. It's a reaction and clearly an overstep, overreaching of its bounds to people believing that in the last 8 years or even longer than that there's been an over-focus on diversity and people of color in America are receiving too much of a voice in America's current political climate.
Yeah, I think it reminded me when I first saw it of like the whole idea of like, I can't be racist if I don't see color. And I think that's the wrong way to look at the issue, and I think in a lot of ways it's been proven that in order to truly understand other people's perspectives, you have to learn to appreciate their cultures for what they are rather than pretending they don't exist. Right. And that was kind of my first implication with this. The other one was that, like, from a scientific perspective, being the CDC, like, not having the word diversity would be a huge issue when conducting research, be it on like genetic diversity, biodiversity. That's not really CDC, but anything like that just is simply impractical, and it kind of puts a soundbite or like a portrayal of an agenda over like simply practical, and will get in the way certainly of CDC's mission in a lot of ways. To pick out the next word, there are a couple. I would like to focus on the word fetus. By banning the word fetus from the CDC and Health and Human Services, I perceive it as an attempt to simply not talk about this issue, or my other idea is that by banning the word fetus, how do you call a baby, like, I don't know, you basically have to say unborn child, which kind of personifies it a little bit and kind of guides you towards the beliefs of Trump regarding abortion and all of that. Which, regardless of what you think, I think is an inappropriate limitation on First Amendment and free speech, and reminded me almost of a Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood's story of essentially how the government was able to define women's lives, and in this case it is literally the government telling you from what is supposed to be the scientific source of credibility from the government, telling women how to define something that is going on with their bodies, and again, simply not a restriction on free expression that I don't agree with really in any way, and it's just pushing an agenda.
And I think the really some of the most important words to me, probably, especially in relation to the CDC, is evidence-based and science-based, and that is just it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous.
It's
It's shocking.
scary.
It's frightening,
It's
yeah.
scary. It's scary to me as an American because it's really interesting because so much focus around the media and around everything has been on this concept of fake news and promoting something that actually sticks to the facts and is like not partisan in any way. But when you're banning the words that are evidence-based and science-based, which literally is going directly to facts, it seems like you're promoting that fake news that we're trying to distance ourselves from, and you're more looking. For example, when there was discussion around climate change and there was talk that it was like perpetuated by like the Chinese or something, like it kind of seems like to be feeding into that because we're moving away from science, we're moving closer to theorems, and like that just doesn't make sense in regular American culture, and that especially does not make sense within the culture of the CDC and that organization as a whole.
I think, other words on here just worth noting are vulnerable, transgender. We touched on some of the other ones, and I think it just speaks to basically like what they're sending the message as the Trump agenda to be, and almost Orwellian in that it is very scary to see the government taking this large of a role in what people are allowed to say as scientific expression, and
I think it's also really kind of revealing of what this presidency and administration is all about, which is kind of just like talk and inflation and not really actively doing anything, because putting a ban on all these words, like, it's frightening for us, the prospect of it, but it's also just kind of this presidency and this administration going like, well, this is what we believe and this is what's wrong and we're going to show it to you, and kind of use our place of power to like enforce it, but not really have any real outcome. And it's just all very bizarre the way that they go about it.
And also, like, why are we focusing on the words that the CDC uses? I mean, like,
Right.
like
That's
Puerto
exactly
Rico,
like-
like Puerto Rico needs help. Flint,
Right.
they literally,
that
Flint
blows
still
my mind.
needs water, and we have all these atrocities going on across the country, and it's not even just pertaining to people of color that this government administration has clearly shown that they care less about. There's things going on inside the communities that Trump has promised to help. There's things going on inside of like West Virginia and the Midwest and all those places that went heavily for Trump. And for him not even to look to the people that voted for him, and instead is focusing on on what words
Just
the
a lot of
CDC
talk.
using, it's just it's horrifying.
It's reflective, I think, of a couple of ideas. One being that democratic backsliding, this idea that the transition from democracy to not quite authoritarianism in the case of the United States, but certainly the lack of democratic processes, is something that happens through legal proceedings. This is not an illegal act, or at least it hasn't been deemed one yet, and it is simply establishing the norm that it is okay to censor the official government contributions to science and health and human services, and for the government to define what that is. That's why people get scared when Trump tweets calling a judge a so-called judge, or when he questions the press, calling them fake news. All of this is just suggestive of a transition that is the government being more trustworthy than the general populace, and that, while it seems petty, is also a very scary concept. I think also we'll forget about this in a week, and it does serve as the smokescreen thing we kind of talked about even on the first podcast. If you go back to that moment, it looks to be a consistent strategy for Trump.
And again, I brought this up with Roy Moore too. Again, this is putting something on the Republican Party as a whole, and like the whole concept of the establishment Republican, like, and what their base actually stands for. Like, this is not what their base stands for. Like, I know that for sure. Like, I'm a Democrat, and I know Republicans are not for restricting free speech. They've never been. And
the opposite, actually.
yeah, it's quite
Stick to the Constitution.
Exactly. They're sticklers for that, and then this is going away from this. So I don't know what type of Republicanism this is, or even if it's Republican at all. But it's sad that this is what's being put out, and what people are going to begin to associate that with the party.
I think also something you mentioned earlier that's really important is like the issues being ignored, and I know we talked about that, but for me it's kind of reflective of what Trump's whole agenda is, this idea of, I think Fareed Zakarian CNN was talking about it, like plutocratic populism, where he runs on this campaign of helping the lost people in West Virginia and Middle America, and then uses his tax policy to provide a tax cut for the rich. And these seem to be opposing things. It's been proven that his tax policy and the new Republican tax plan won't necessarily help those people in the Midwest, or at least it will do so much less than it would help those in the upper tiers of economic society. So I think just like the duplicity within the whole campaign for me seems obvious, and I guess it would have been obvious to see where he was coming from as a person and then say that's probably what his policies are going to be, help where he came from. But certainly that he ran on a campaign that said the opposite, just kind of interesting perspective for sure.
And I think talking about the tax bill, I think there's really two important things. The first relating to like the use of like earmarks and like stuff that isn't related to the bill, just simply to curry votes, to get votes. And I think that's I mean, of course it's allowed, but I think it's definitely very shady to the American public. You know, you think you're passing a tax bill, and then there's so much underneath
Surprise,
it.
you're getting a pipeline.
Yeah, surprise, you're getting a
of
pipeline.
national monuments.
Yeah, and so I just think that you want governments to be transparent, and that's what everybody wants. It's not a Republican or Democratic thing. And I also, with the tax plan that I worry about is based off the information that I've read. If the tax plan doesn't go exactly according to the plan for like literally like the first 10 years, where they're like tax cuts for the rich, and what they're expecting for it to do is for that to like
$5 trillion.
Yeah, is for that to help the economy, and for eventually that to like kind of like do sort of like a trickle down effect to like the Midwest and those West Virginia areas. If that doesn't go perfectly according to Trump's plan, this is going to be terrible for those people, and it's really going to hurt them. And
there doesn't seem to be much of a backup plan either. It's like,
Exactly.
okay, so if after 10 years it costs more than 1.5 trillion, it can't continue. But like, well then what? We've already spent all this money and we're kind of screwed.
I mean, you measure kind of like U.S. indebtedness, which is what the concern there is over the GDP, and I think like ultimately you reinvest in basically policy that would help spur growth in the United States if that's
But
the
there's
case.
just no safety net, is what I'm saying. It's like they're saying like this will happen after 10 years. Like we have to look
There's
at
very
it
little
again. But
guarantee
like,
of that, yeah.
okay, sure.
That's a great way to end it. So that is our discussion on the CDC, tax plan, and a couple of other things, and moving on. So finishing up our discussion for this podcast, we feel it is essential to touch on what is one of the major occurrences of this week and the past few weeks. Developing net neutrality was officially repealed by the FCC in a 3-2 vote along party lines. However, that statement is slightly misleading given that there was a general bipartisan consensus on the idea that net neutrality was a positive regulation and that it shouldn't be repealed. Ajit Pai, in line with Trump's idea of repealing Obama-era legislation, also an ex-Verizon lawyer who certainly had some sort of stake in repealing it, was a major proponent and the deciding vote in what happened. So I think it's important that we just address what this is, because there are a lot of misconceptions, but it certainly is damaging, maybe not to the extent people are saying, but it's worth understanding. So if you guys want to explain simply what it is as a tenant.
Yeah, so based off my research so far and my reading, it seems like net neutrality is kind of our protection over those big internet service providers such as like Verizon, AT&T, I guess Time Warner, etc., Comcast, etc., slowing down certain servers, certain websites, or even blocking, I've read. But I'm not sure if it relates to the whole concept that's been going around, kind of like Twitter, and in terms of like you having to like pay for Instagram or things like that. I think that's like one misconception about it.
Yeah, I think that one of the things you were seeing often was like, you want Twitter, $4.99. You want Instagram, $4.99. Like $2 per Google search. And to be honest, that's not a realistic way of looking at it. You will probably end up paying a small premium for these services, but it really affects more the interaction between internet service providers or ISPs and different larger providers of information. And under net neutrality, what it says is that all data, regardless of size, is treated equally with how fast it's being streamed. And without net neutrality now, Verizon can charge Facebook, say, or YouTube, who do video content, which is a lot more data than, say, email, they can charge them a premium to maintain the speed of that production. So then that means Facebook's gonna have to maintain profit margins. You'll probably pay a $3 premium.
I think it's important to look at the context of this issue, because when it was first put into place was when the internet was first available to consumers for consumer use. And during that time, it was far less advanced. We didn't have Netflix and YouTube and all these like high data, high volume services that we could use on the internet. And so it made sense that it would kind of be a net blanketed cost to all services. But looking at it now, as Ian said, it requires a lot more to stream a video or YouTube or Netflix as opposed to load an email or do a simple Google search. It's like that on airplanes, for example. Like when you get on the airplane, you can't log into Netflix because it requires such bandwidth. And so, it does kind of make sense when you put it in that perspective.
What I will say is that in that perspective, it entirely makes sense, but there's a lot of implications that come with repealing it.
Absolutely.
And it wasn't, it was a 2015 Obama era legislation. It just hadn't really, the internet was kind of not doing well. You were seeing a lot of throttling and other stuff before. It kind of went under the radar for a lot of people, but it certainly was an issue before. But now the issue is going to be like Verizon, who is not just an ISP, but also has various services that compete with companies like Netflix, Hulu, and other different like startups even. If you want to watch TV, what they're basically going to make you do is pay for their service. They're going to create like a bundle, and you'll have the TV package, and you have to pay for Hulu, Netflix, HBO, Verizon service, and various other stuff that you wouldn't necessarily need, but that's going to raise the rate of that what you're paying for is like what the general worry is. And then I think in reference to Facebook, YouTube, big companies, it's less of an issue, but talking about the startup space, if there's a startup that competes with any of Verizon, Comcast, or AT&T's interests, they then have the power to throttle that connection and force that small company, which obviously can't afford it, to pay a premium for faster data for its consumers. So they can basically run competitive startups out of the internet, and that to me is simply not acceptable. And it's sad to see that go because it really crushes opportunity for a lot of people, which is the opposite of what Ajipai's agenda says, which is that like corporations will have more money to invest in making their services better, which will then open up more opportunity, which I simply don't see as realistic.
Yeah, and I think another aspect of this is we have to remember how much in the internet's growing role in politics and really everything that we do in movement building. Like the reason why like the Women's March like spread so much is because you had that internet presence, and you could see on Facebook like who's going, and so many people, everybody has access to that, and they can see that. And one of the things that I worry about with this net neutrality vote is when you have these companies that are Verizon or whatever who have the control over this type of thing, they can promote their interests, their political interests, and then use that to their advantage. So then you have voices that are being silenced, and it's un-American for that to be happening. But I do understand what you're saying in terms of data, because that is something to consider. But I just think that on the other side, like we have so much more to lose.
It's a broad set of regulations. It's not targeted.
It'll certainly change the experience of the daily internet user, because as it does become more expensive for these companies and these websites, how do they compensate for that? It's not going to come out of their pockets, that's for sure. And so does that mean more ads? Does that mean slower loading time? We'll see how that plays out. But I also do have faith that should it get bad enough and frustrating enough for the daily user, like we said, the congressmen and women also have to experience that. It's not an isolated issue. It's something that affects such a broad margin of people that if it's bad enough, I have faith that our government will do something to fix it.
Yeah, and I think, like you mentioned it earlier, the odds that this isn't held up in the courts are small. I think there's a strong argument to be made for it at this point, like internet as a tool for upward mobility, for it being considered almost a human right. So whether that holds up or not, because it is a big claim, may not be successful, but that will certainly delay the institution of these new regulations, or lack thereof.
There's one thing going off of what Amelia said that I'm also worried about is when you have a situation like, let's say, net neutrality, for whatever reason, somehow magically gets through the courts, which I don't think it will, but it does. And what's kind of built up is this kind of like Verizon, AT&T, like sort of lobby, where they have like so much control over these people's campaigns that the congressmen and women, they can't rise up against these companies. They're like just after like every like mass shooting, like you have a group of congressmen and women that feel like they can't rise up against like the NRA's lobby because they have so much money and they can influence elections in such a way, and they connect with so many people, and that's one of the things that I think we should be considering in terms of like if something goes wrong, if something goes very wrong with net neutrality, can we really fight back?
Yeah. Scary thing to think about, certainly an important thing to think about. That wraps up our discussion of net neutrality. Just noting other things that have gone on in the world that are important to note that maybe aren't necessarily political, but I think worth mentioning. Bitcoin's meteoric rise has compelled many to start mining Bitcoin or to start investing in Bitcoin or purchasing Bitcoin. And there's also claims of it being a bubble, which is fairly likely, to be honest, given what it looks like. That said, Bitcoin may be a bubble. Cryptocurrency, I think, is here to stay as it sees new approval from different international governments and gains that kind of grounding, which is really what it's been lacking, why people don't trust it. I think that the distrust of high-up bankers at JP Morgan Chase and many other places is really the best evidence that it's going to be successful, because they are fearful of it and therefore try and decrease public perception of it. While Bitcoin itself may lose its value, cryptocurrency is certainly here to stay. So my best advice would be to invest in Litecoin, invest in Ethereum, invest in other smaller types of coins, which comparatively are worth much, much less than Bitcoin. As when people pull out of Bitcoin, they're likely to diversify and not to pull out completely.
In other news, Trump named Jerusalem the official capital and made clear his intent to move our embassy to that location, of course sparking a lot of controversy, and this has the potential for violence. And
you've almost seen it already.
We've pretty much seen it already, and for continued and really intensified conflict. So that's something we are going to keep our eye on as that progresses.
Yeah. Other than that, thank you very much for tuning in to our third edition of the MGR Podcast. We appreciate your listening, and we will hopefully be back with another podcast sometime soon. Thank you very much. Signing off.
Amelia.
Ian.
Hamilton.